First of all, I thank you very much, Nana, for the kind introduction, and a very grateful thank you for organising this event. It's always a great pleasure to be back here at the Daiwa Foundation, and in particular it's always a great pleasure to be here and be able to engage on discussions over topics that are timely and of great interest insofar as the transformation of Japan as an international security and military actor are concerned. First of all, as we were discussing, I should point out that we really want to try to focus on the broader political process around the constitutional reform. Therefore, the events of the past couple of weeks in Japan, whilst they're important, will have a repercussion, but they're not the centre focus of our discussion today. Secondly, I also want to reassure everyone in the room that we really didn't have anything to do with the scandal coming out last week, because we wanted to make this seminar more timely. It just happened. So it's an unhappy coincidence, as it were. Nonetheless, the way we're going to do this, we thought to do it in a slightly more discursive fashion. We have lined up a couple of slides just to look at the background, where we're coming from, where we are, what the possible different options for these reforms are. Of course, that assuming that at some point it will sort of go on, which in itself is a question to debate. And then we set up a few questions at the end to discuss in terms of the implication of the possible reforms to come about. Without further ado, I think probably the best thing is to hand it over to Swashi here for which one do I bring up? Which one is it? This one? I can tell you either way. It's the other one. Yes, that's the one. Yay, got it. So, brilliant. Deck. There we are.
So, you want to stand up, please?
Yeah, I'll be here and I'll just...
Okay, well, should I just stand up and we do this like a mantra?
Yes, this is my command.
I love that.
Okay, that's the way to go. Thank you. No, that's the different slides. Which one? Yeah, thank you. So what I'm going to do is to give you some few dot points to cover the basics. I'm sure that there are some in this audience. There are some people who are very familiar with the background to this constitutional reform. And various events of various events that are currently going on. But for those of you who are not so familiar with the Japanese politics and or the backgrounds that leads to this constitutional reform debate, we would highlight a few dot points so that we can start the conversation on the shared grounds. So the first is that the current move towards the constitutional reform is pretty much driven by the ruling party, the current ruling party, Democratic Liberal Party. And this party, we use the acronym LDP, is actually established with the mission to achieve a constitutional reform when it was established in 1955. So if you look at the constitutional party principles the LDP adopted in 1955, there was already a reference to the constitutional reform. So it's not something that's actually new to the LDP's agenda. But the current move towards the constitutional reform actually started back in 2012 when LDP won the power in government back from the opposition party. And in the general election manifesto, it was clearly mentioned that the LDP would seek a constitutional reform, particularly a revision of what is called Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, also known as the non-renunciation clause. And Dr. Pratano will be explaining some of the backgrounds of the constitutional provision in a minute. And so that was the manifesto in 2012, and then it's sort of gone silent since then a while. But Prime Minister Abe, in his video appearance on the Constitutional Day on 3rd of May 2017, he advocated for the sort of renewal of this constitutional revision agenda and called for this debate within the LDP party, not as a Prime Minister, but as the leader of the LDP at that time. And since then, this constitutional revision was also put as an agenda at the last general election held in October 2017, and that set the motion for the official sort of consideration of constitutional reform currently undertaken within the LDP, and with a view to adoption of the constitutional revision in Diet in the forthcoming sessions.
Now, as Nasa-san was explaining, was the 2012 is the official starting date where the LDP brought back into the mainstream agenda their political platform the discussion on the constitutional reform. It should be said also that the process behind it, behind the decision, it's wider and certainly draws its origins in sort of 2007. In fact, you could sort of put together 2007, 2014 as one long sort of block during which an advisory panel was established under the aegis of Prime Minister Abe, precisely to review and investigate, to develop an opinion about how, first of all, the Constitution should be interpreted, with a specific focus on Article 9, which, as probably many of you know, remains, the interpretation of which remains kind of contested even in Japan. And secondly, also make suggestions as to, based on the panel's view of how one should interpret in particular the Article 9 of the Constitution, what kind of recommendation in terms of steps to take to not only change the interpretation, but in the long term, set in motion a chain that would lead to constitutional reform in a broader sense. If we look at this period as a period during which there's a process that is developed, a discussion that is led by these advisory boards, and this period can be further subdivided into two sort of main dividing points. And it is the 2013-14 period when Prime Minister Abe comes back into power for the second time as a Prime Minister. There is a significant shift and change in the way the advisory panel's sort of task changes. The final report that he submitted in May 2014 highlights this division, this point of separation, due to the changing strategic context. The original mandate was very narrow. In fact, it was focused on specific cases, and it really was centered on this idea of the extent to which it was possible to reinterpret the meaning of Article 9. The changing strategic context that is sort of injected both in the National Defence Programme guidelines of 2013 and in the first ever adopted National Security Strategy, both of them coming out same week in December 2013, provided the raw materials to review and expand the original mandates. It's not just about engaging with the question, oh, what if in this specific situation what we're supposed to do is a broader mandate as to what is that our Constitution allows us to do. And in that sense, there is that build-up towards a movement to reform the Constitution itself. And so really, the main change that the advisory panel did during this period of time was from addressing specific scenarios, which was the main task set out in 2007, to assess the meaning of the Constitution against the logic of basic principles of national defense. In a way, the mandate is widened, and in a way, the question of interpreting the Constitution becomes at that point binded together with the revision of the Constitution itself. Interestingly, this translated in particular insofar as the Article 9 is considered as a contrast between the absolute meaning, right? So this idea that Article 9 has a meaning in itself that prevents Japan to exercise the right of self-defense, particularly as a result of that, the right of collective self-defense, to what the government's position was, and the advisory board certainly sort of was similar, taking a baseline, that Article 9 is very generic in its sort of practical implication. It has to be contextualized and interpreted given the conditions and circumstances of the day. So there's two different schools of thoughts. The main fundamental difference being the more legalistic one, empowering Article 9 with an absolute sense that cannot be sort of changed, and an opposite school of thoughts that rather puts the emphasis on, yes, it has an absolute meaning, but that meaning has to be implemented according to the circumstances of the day. And that's the job of the government. The government should be empowered to take that interpretation and push those boundaries. In the post-2015, and 2015 is an important point because that's where, with the build-up of, in light of the reports that the advisory panel presents to the government, then the government works its way around the setting in motion process for enacting a new security legislation package that is agreed upon in 2015. They only take on board the part of the advice provided by the report in the report. But the key point is that in light of the security legislations, of which we can sort of talk about a bit more later, after 2015, one of the core issues that is left to be addressed, that is not addressed, and certainly becomes one of the battlegrounds where constitutional reform has the strongest meaning, is addressing the question of what it is that the Constitution allows in terms of the concept of self-defense. How does it apply in practical terms as a nation, and as a nation that works in the context of the UN mandates and other coalitions and alliances, and the status of the self-defense forces. And to the present day, these seem to remain two of the core issues that were not fully addressed in the security legislation, but still are very much at the heart of this idea of the importance of having a constitutional reform. The status of the self-defense forces perhaps being the single most important element at the moment in the centre of the debate.
So as Dr. Palatano explained, the current sort of a debate about constitutional reform, you could say is a sort of a reflection of the frustration on the part of politicians. They felt, particularly during this 2015 security legislation debate. And interestingly, when Prime Minister Abe appeared in his video message calling for the constitutional reform debate, he also referred to some timeline for this debate. And he basically said that well, he expected to see constitutional reform or revisions be done by the end of 2020. Now, of course, the party's position is that the timeline is not fixed. So there may be a longer debate, and they certainly don't promise that the constitutional reform will be achieved by 2020. But if you actually try to achieve constitutional revision by the end of 2020, the timeline looks rather tight. That's simply because this is the first time we have done. Remember, the Japan, if it actually does go ahead, the Japan would go through this process for constitutional revision. So there are many uncertainties about how it may actually go about. But certainly a national referendum is a requirement, a constitutional requirement, as you can see in Article 96 of the Constitution. And according to the law concerning the national referendum, the Japanese public must be given sometime between 60 to 180 days for the referendum. And given that this is the first time, it's expected that the government would allow the maximum 180 days for national referendum. And then another thing is that after, or if it's successful, then after the promulgation of the new constitution, it has to be a certain period of time before it comes into force. And again, it's uncertain as to how long the Diet will allow a time for the new constitution to come into force. But the current constitution actually allowed 6 months for the entry into force of a constitution. So if the Diet follow the same format, that's another 6 months. So if Japan wants to achieve a constitutional reform by the end of 2020, basically the Diet has to finalize the debate and actual text for national referendum by November 2019. And as you can see, particularly 2019, the calendar of the various events of national significance are lined up quite heavily. And certainly it's not a good idea to hold a national referendum to coincide, for example, with those serious events concerning the imperial palace. There's emperor's abdication of its throne at the end of April, and there'll be a new emperor thrown in at the beginning of May, and there'll be certain ceremonies with various dignitaries from foreign countries. So 2019 would be a very difficult time to hold the national referendum. So the only chance, or better chance, would be found in 2018, but even at this stage, now end of March 2018, even the internal debate within the LDP about the actual text for the revision of the constitution remains unsettled. And that sort of indicated that certain difficulties in finalizing text in the debate in the Diet in the current Diet session, which is scheduled to end at the end of June. So there may be some chance to do that in September or October, but if they fail, if they lose that chance, then it will be very difficult to make that happen. Thank you. And the current proposals, so as I said, the current proposals, this is a sort of proposals that are sort of debated at the end of last year. And as I understand, there are now 7 different proposed texts just for the revision of Article 9. So that shows how difficult now to finalize the text, even within the LDP. But as of last year, at this time of last year, there were 2 different options, and those 7 proposals currently on the table are largely divided into one of those 2 different ideas. So one idea, and there are other proposed revision as well, so inclusion of a state of emergency clause, which is currently absent in the Constitution. And electoral reform and Article 26 and right to education to be revised. So, but those are less politically sensitive questions. The most sensitive question is Article 9 revision. So the first part of proposal is to retain the current clause, both paragraph 1 and 2 of Article 9, and another new clause which explicitly mentions and refers to the right of self-defense and or the existence of the self-defense forces as the constitutionally legitimate forces in Japan. Second idea is to delete or replace the second clause, the second paragraph of current Article 9, and add a new clause with a clear statement about the nature and role of self-defense forces, or even renaming the forces as a national or Japan national defense forces, or Japanese defense forces. And the Prime Minister Abe, when in his video appearance, he called for the first option as a possible option to the revision of the Article 9 of the Constitution, whereas the 2012 party proposal for the constitutional revision in its manifesto was actually referring to the second option of deleting paragraph 2 of Article 9. So there's a deep division between those 2 positions within the LDP itself.
So, obviously, there are a number of points to consider as we move forward in the discussion. And certainly this is a very fluid debate, something that continues to evolve. So the idea here is to engage with some of the core issues, underscoring the question of constitutional reform, but then really trying to widen the discussion and engage with the audience in order to move forward. One of the latest developments, for example, would suggest that besides of the internal difficulties in the LDP to find a common line of agreement as to how to change Article 9, there is also the need to enlist the support, particularly of the coalition party, the Coordinator, which is against this idea of rewriting the paragraphs, and one of the reasons why Prime Minister Abe seems to be more inclined to argue the third paragraph is related to this sort of political management partnership with other parties. And this is an interesting point that perhaps we can discuss further afterwards, especially right now with the current scandals, the impact of needing allies and enlisting allies more than before might actually have an impact on the original LDP-centric discussion about this. They will remain at the forefront of that discussion, but they might actually have to enlist sort of extra muscle, as it were. With the constitutional revision, solve all the Article 9 questions once and for all. Regardless, especially regardless of what happens in the next September leadership contest, it is sort of a fairly acceptable proposition that Prime Minister Abe will not be as strong as he appeared right after the election in 2017. Therefore, this will be a negotiated text. This will be a compromise. And in many respects, it will probably fail to address all the issues concerning Article 9. Partly because these issues can be broadly divided into two sets of problems. One is the relationship between military power and statecraft. How does Japan engage in international security? And that is about politics, it's about alliances, it's about strategy. But then there is also, if you want, a more operational questions that unfolds from that, and is related to the conduct of operation. How the new constitutional setup would have an impact on the ability of the Japanese to interact with others. And here the question is really sort of connected to the broader point of self-defense as opposed to collective self-defense, and what are the boundaries, what are the options there that exist today, and what would be sort of happening right afterwards. Certainly it would appear that, particularly with the new setup whereby you add the paragraph, it is unlikely that there will be sort of strong statements about that. Probably it is quite likely that, if at all discussed, it will be some sort of limited collective self-defense setup. That's certainly one of the options that at the moment seems to be debated in the media as the one political compromise that would allow for that. But again, will it address all the problems that unfold from Article 9? Highly unlikely, especially as we are today. Will the constitutional revision lead to the militarization of Japan?
You don't want me to comment on the first one? Or is that...
Oh yes, oh, yeah, no, sorry, I thought we were going, no, go ahead, yes, you're right.
So yes, certainly Dr. Palatano is right. The final text, well, if it actually is a successful attempt to revise the constitution, is likely to be a compromise text. But even if the final text is what the Prime Minister Abe is hoping to achieve, or other factions of LDP is hoping to see, none of the constitutional debates that have happened and is going to happen would remain unresolved. Simply because so far in its history, all the constitutional debate about surrounding Article 9 has been very political rather than legal. So even if the Constitution actually explicitly acknowledges the existence of the defense forces, or Japan's right to self-defense, either individual or the collective, still there will be people who question the legality or constitutionality of every single SDF operations overseas, or any legislative attempt by the ruling party to change any piece of legislation. So those political debates would continue to be raised, no matter how the Constitution, Article 9 of the Constitution will be revised. The only way to resolve this, and particularly another thing I should mention, is the weakened sort of authority or credibility of the constitutional what's the bureau?
Yeah, the Constitutional Bureau.
LBL, Constitutional Bureau.
Okay.
Cabinet
Legal Bureau. Yes.
Certainly Cabinet Legal Bureau has been very strong in maintaining sort of constitutionality of various pieces of legislation in the past. Since 2012, I think it was perhaps after that, when the Prime Minister appointed someone from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs rather than from internally from the CBL, meant that the sort of relationship between the cabinet and the legislative bureau is not as strong, and that would probably mean that the actual authority that the cabinet legislation bureau carries with the opinion or understanding of constitutionality of certain legislation may be compromised. So the only way out of it, to give a meaningful legal assessment of any future legislation, would be to give the Supreme Court the competence to assess the constitutionality of legislation or the conduct of the government. But at the moment, the revision of the Constitution doesn't really reach that far, and certainly to my knowledge, there is no debate whatsoever about the creation of Constitutional Court or giving the Supreme Court the authority to assess the constitutional issues without following the sort of ordinary procedures for the lawsuit. That's one way, a possible way out of this, but certain at the moment it is not under debate.
So, will the constitutional revision lead to the militarization of Japan? Nah, honestly. I mean, it depends very much on how you define militarization, whether it is sort of the enhancement of capabilities or the militarization as in sort of connecting the policy decision making more to and expose it more, in having more informed by the political and civilian elites of the Ministry of Defence. Generally speaking, that is unlikely to happen regardless of the constitutional change, because the changed status of the self-defense forces would not in itself translate in any modification from the perspective of the bureaucratic process. More importantly, the very significant changes that have been taking place in terms of the reshaping of policy process on defence and security matters has already sort of started with the creation of the National Security Council, and particularly under Prime Minister Abe, the sort of an enhanced centrality of the government, the Prime Minister's office, and the National Security Council. And one very good example is that, for example, the senior military advisor to the National Security Council at the moment has changed in nature. Now there's a 2-star level flag officer, and the present NSS senior military advisor, the Rear Admiral, was the first commander of CDF 151, Rear Admiral Ito, who previously was the Director General of the J5, which is the plans and policy of the Joint Staff Office. So certainly there is an understanding that there's a shift of power, and the Ministry of Defence has moved it's upped its game in terms of sending to the NSC top people in order to contribute to the debate. But that also means that the Ministry of Defence is only one of several actors and not necessarily the strongest. Constitutional reform won't affect that. So that's sort of the most important transformation are already being sort of been put in place, and it really is not so much to do with that. Militarization in terms of capabilities, I have a very good example. That's the current debate. You knew I wouldn't get the presentation go without a caveat in it, which is one thing. successful presentation are always a big ship on it. It's a killer. So that's the news has been covered in the past few days, is the idea that because the government has decided, the Ministry of Defence has decided to go on with the purchase of the F-35B, there is a speculation as to how the F-35B then would be used as a launching pad for modifying the Izumo class destroyer to become a small aircraft carrier. Comments the past couple of days in the media from officials at the Ministry of Defence deny the fact that this carrier would be out of the remit of the constitutional mandate. In fact, they are actually correct, even in the sort of most conservative interpretation that you want to give to the meaning of Article 9. For very specific technical reasons that I could bore you to death, suffice to say that this modification, if it were to happen, and it could happen, would unlikely generate, from an operational perspective, a platform that would be capable of considerable strike power, which is the threshold that since 2005 has been sort of clearly set out by the Ministry of Defence and Defence Agency as to what is the difference between an offensive platform and a defensive one. What this modified version with F-35B would do would mostly provide air defence cover for a fleet operating outside of the range of Japanese national shores, short of working together with coalition partners, that is most likely the United States or an international coalition. So mostly what we're talking about is a piece of kit that would help the fleet to protect itself from, in terms of operating far away from national shores in a highly kinetic environment, period. It doesn't give it much more than that. Because as much as you can pack in there, probably you're looking about sort of 12 to 15, depending on how the parking arrangements is, it's not that much. Would it do it? Would it not do it? That's a different story. If they do, there would be a precedent. That's with the submarines. In the early 2000s, the Japanese took off the line the Asashiro submarine, which was an almost brand new submarine, 6 years life in the fleet. And they took it offline, cut it into, added a section to try a new propulsion, the AIP system. They did that because that was an important investment, and it was essential to bring the submarine fleet into its future for the following 40 years. So they wanted to test it at its best. What would happen here is something similar. You take off the line an important piece of kit that in terms of size is the minimum necessary in order to start developing your doctrinal and operational muscle to know how to operate a small carrier. So that will not be, if they do that, it's because they will probably have in mind to develop a larger type of platform. So that itself is not a problem, it's the political process that in itself that would sort of generate. The second example is activities, but I'll come back to this in a moment because it falls into the next question. So
about the militarization, to the extent that the current constitutional revision debate is designed to eliminate any concerns whatsoever about the constitutionality of Japan's right of self-defense and self-defense forces. Of course, it's simply just recognizing the current status quo, so it doesn't really lead to any militarization of such a policy. But nevertheless, there is some concern, and certainly I would see that this would happen. Is the neighbouring states would use this as a sort of an opportunity to label Japan's move as such as a militarization, a further militarization. And that's a real concern given that some of those regional, neighbouring states have been employing and developing a very sophisticated misinformation operations and strategies. And Japan is particularly vulnerable to misinformation operations. So even though the intention is not really to militarize, as Dr. Karatano clearly explained, it doesn't have such effect whatsoever, and nonetheless it may be advocated as being having such an effect. So that would be the concern that people should be aware of in looking at this process of constitutional revision.
So what about the broader impact on regional security? What I'll try to focus on is the positive side of that coin, and then I leave to my colleague the darker, more difficult task to look at the other part of that story. And I have here a very nice piece of document that comes from the official, it's an exchange of notes, but it's for all intended purposes, is the State of Forces agreement between the government of Japan and the government of Djibouti. That is the piece of document that was signed in order to sort of establish the so-called overseas military base. Japan's the first overseas military base of the post-war era. Now, if you look at that, the parts that are highlighted, I apologize for the lack of focus in some of them, the bits on the activities is very important because it clearly suggests taking law enforcement measures to counter acts of piracy off the Somali coast. That is the reason that is provided for that base to exist. If you compare this particular part in terms of definition of activities, why we need this base and why we've been agreed by the Djibouti local authorities to do so, and you compare it with the French SOFA or the American SOFA, this is by far the most constrained. It's the only one that specifically mentions law enforcement measures, which means that legally, even if you wanted to, you cannot run it as a military base for overseas military operation. The only reason why this document could come to life, and therefore the base come to life, was if the operational remit was extremely limited. Now, of course, you could argue that from a normative perspective, that's a good thing. But if you're also trying to engage with the broader context of the Japanese, of Prime Minister Abe, proactive contribution to peace slogan, that limits significantly how proactive you can be in managing international security, because that base and the activities that you can run from there is extremely limited in what you can do. Interestingly enough, the Japanese are working at the same time very closely from an operational perspective with a combined maritime forces command in Bahrain. And that's precisely because what the constitutional setup allowed them to do in the context of Djibouti was extremely limited. And it's interesting that this sort of logic is gauged also in the way the description about the facilities. Everything is connected, so there is no way to escape. Of course, an exchange of notes can be changed. You can revise it, right? And therefore, to an extent, a constitutional revision, depending on how far where to go, it could allow, for example, for avoiding the current setup, which is every single time an activity has to be put in place, you have to have like ad hoc special legal measures enacted in order for that to take place. It would widen the sort of basic framework for action without removing the safeguard of political choice in that sense. What is really interesting, and this is really very striking when you compare it to other SOFAs, that it also mentions the waters. So the American SOFA and the French SOFA have absolutely no reference whatsoever. In fact, the American SOFA has no reference whatsoever of what they do. It's like, we're just taking this piece of land, thank you very much, which is quite interesting in itself. I mean, if I were to put them on a spectrum, the French is somewhere in the middle, because part of the SOFA is about conducting activities with Djiboutians in Africa for the stability of Africa. The Americans is, we're here to do our business, thank you. And the Japanese are, we're here just to do law enforcement on the piracy. Nothing else. We promise. Thank you. Right? And that so the last bit really it comes across from the waters, because the contract clearly defines that the SOFA applies to the internal waters and territorial sea of the Republic of Djibouti. So everything that legally they can do is only law enforcement within the context of that. In fact, the convoy escort that the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Forces has been doing is under the command of CTF 151. But so there is a very interesting, almost twisted logic by which the moment that they finish convoy, right, operationally they can't do much other than sail back into the Djibouti and stay there in case there's a pirate that wants to board their ship or something. And so in that sense, the Constitution could have a positive effect in creating, propelling a process whereby, in terms of policy, you have to engage more deeply, if you want, about the kind of responsibilities as an international actor you want to have. See, at the moment, this is very convenient, because it means that the baseline is very small. Then if you really push it, you can try to put something more on top of that, right? So it prevents to have, at the beginning, a very important debate and discussion as to, okay, what exactly is that we want to do? What is our role in the bigger scheme of things?
Yes, so yes, thank you. So impact for the regional security. Now, it's quite clear the outcome, whether it's successful or failure of the current constitutional revision debate has a huge implications for regional security. That's simply because certainly among the policymakers in Japan, there's now a feeling that they have reached the limit in terms of what they can do through the legislative changes in responding to contemporary security challenges within the framework of the current constitution. So that means that when the security dynamics change and evolve in the region, Japan is sort of, their hands are cuffed at the back, and they can't really respond in any way through the further legislative changes. So they are hoping that this constitutional revision, if it's successful, then give the Japanese government and Diet more cards on the table to use or even show in responding to any security threats that might emanate from neighboring countries. So without that, Japan is really stuck in a very difficult position. So the constitutional revision can only be sort of a breakthrough in that respect. Yeah.
So what would be the consequences of failing to revise the Constitution? Mostly that in 10 years' time I'll still be here talking to you about it, pretty much. And in the sense that we'll be here over and over going back and forth, because Hitoshi's last point about having reached the limits of how much you can stretch the Constitution before that article kind of loses its own regional sense, we're quite pretty much there. And there is a sense of, I was conducting interviews about this at the end of last summer in DC. There is a general sense of agreement among the US-Japan alliance managers that you now reached the top of the plateau, right? You're there. You need something more in order to move forward and make more of the alliance, which for the last 70 years has been some sort of the benchmark of how far Japan committed beyond its national boundaries to international security. So we are very much at a point in time where failing to revise the Constitution, of course, will protect, but would certainly hamper the ability of the Japanese government to have the political choice, if they so wish, to try to do more or to do something else, which at the moment doesn't really exist in that respect. Of course, all of this, I suppose, is contingent to how regional context evolves. Japan might actually change the constitution, but we should not forget that in Japan, change does not automatically translate into new policy or setting new horizons. Looking around and looking at the regional context is always a very important sort of factor in defining how far any new institutional and legal framework will allow for new policy action to be taken. So I think one of the most important points about the constitutional revision is that it really, from my perspective, is one of the crucial point of contention. Either you take a position of principle as it can't be changed, in which case one has to be honest and go back and think about, well, then Japan should consider different ways to present itself as an international state actor. Or you take that leap of faith, you jump, and you try to sort of calm down with a constitutional arrangement that, at least at the very basic level, will allow policy action to test new places. That is probably the only way to ensure a degree of consistency and relevance of the spirit of the Constitution to the current circumstances without saying anything about the change of these circumstances and the impact that in the future they will have on how Japan will behave